Now, picture Japan. Take a moment and actually do it. Don't rush past it. Picture Japan. The way it lives in your imagination. The way it has been assembled in your mind across your entire life through films, photographs, travel writing. The slow accumulation of images that Japan has projected to the outside world with extraordinary consistency for 70 years. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Wherever you are right now, whatever room you are lying, in whatever city is quiet outside your window, whatever part of the world is dark or just beginning to come into light, drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Tell me what time it is there. I read every single one of them. There is something about seeing someone in Seoul at 2 in the morning next to someone in London, just settling in for the evening next to someone in Chicago who cannot sleep and reached for something to listen to. All of us in completely different places, about to sit with the same story that I find genuinely moving every time. So tell me where you are. I want to know you are almost certainly picturing something beautiful. Cherry blossoms, the specific, almost unbearably delicate pink of sakura petals falling in that particular slow spiral that makes them look less like falling and more like the air itself, is turning them gently, considering them, before letting them go. Stone paths through gardens tended with a level of attention that makes the word tended feel completely insufficient. Gardens where every stone has been considered, where the moss has been cultivated over decades to achieve a specific quality of green, where the angle of a single pine branch has been trained across years to frame the view of a pond in exactly the right way. The low wooden architecture of Kyoto, the luminous vertical chaos of Tokyo at night, the Shinkansen arriving at the platform to the second every time, because in Japan the train being late is not an inconvenience. It is a kind of failure. And in every version of Japan you are picturing politeness. Because Japan is, by almost any measure you can apply, the most formally courteous society on earth. Not polite in the loose, general, good manners sense that most countries claim for themselves. Polite in a way that is structural, built into the architecture of daily life, at every level from the grammar of the language itself, which has entirely separate registers of formality that change depending on your relationship to the person you are speaking to, not just in tone, but in vocabulary and conjugation, and the fundamental way sentences are constructed, all the way down to the behavior of strangers on a subway who have never met and will never meet again, maintaining a collective silence that nobody is enforcing and everybody is choosing. The bow. You know about the bow, but the bow in Japan is not a greeting the way a handshake is a greeting. It is a continuous language. The depth communicates the degree of respect. The duration communicates the sincerity. The number of repetitions carries meaning about the weight of the moment and the nature of the relationship. And the thing that foreigners who spend real time in Japan always notice, the thing that stays with them, is that the bow is performed whether or not it is being observed. Shop staff in Japanese department stores bow to customers who have already walked out the door and cannot see them. The bow is not a performance directed at a recipient. It is an expression of a standard that operates whether or not anyone is watching. The discipline is internal. The courtesy does not require an audience to function. Think about what that implies about how deep this runs. In Japan, the concept of causing inconvenience to others, meiwaku, carries a moral weight that most cultures reserve for significantly more serious transgressions. On the Tokyo subway, which moves 12 million people a day with a punctuality so precise that delays of more than 5 minutes trigger formal public apologies broadcast over the station speakers, you do not speak on your phone. You do not speak loudly at all. The silence of the carriage is maintained not by enforcement, but by 12 million daily individual choices to treat it as a collective good. The silence is voluntary, continuous, chosen by millions of strangers who have no mechanism between them except the shared understanding of what is appropriate in shared space. This Japan is real, completely, genuinely real. The politeness is real. The beauty is real. The cultural achievement is real. The food, the design, the architecture, the film. The particular aesthetic sensibility that runs from the precision of a kaiseki meal to the emotional intelligence of a Studio Ghibli film to the way a department store employee wraps a purchase. All of it is a genuine expression of genuine values held by real people who have built one of the most admired cultures in human history. I want to be precise about this, not as a diplomatic introduction before the criticism starts, but because the story this video is going to tell does not work, does not mean what it actually means. If you walk away thinking that what follows cancels what came before, it does not cancel it. It lives beside it. In a silence so wide and so carefully maintained that most of the world has never noticed, the silence is there. Because here is what this video is actually going to do. Over the next several hours, we are going to walk into that silence together. We are going to go to Nanjing in December 1937, when the Japanese Imperial Army entered a defenseless city and did something that lasted 6 weeks, and that the historical record documents with a completeness that leaves no serious room for doubt. And we are going to sit with it honestly, with the primary sources, with the diaries of the soldiers who were there, and the testimonies of the people who survived, and the records kept by the Westerners who watched and wrote everything down because they understood that someone eventually would need to know. We are going to go to a compound in Manchuria that the Japanese military designated Unit 731 and officially described as a water purification facility. We are going to talk about what actually happened inside it, what was done to the people brought there who ordered it, who carried it out, who knew about it, and what happened to the men responsible after the war ended. That last part will surprise you. It surprised me when I first encountered it. It should have been a larger story than it became, and the reason it did not become a larger story is itself part of the story. We are going to talk about Japan's surrender in August 1945, what actually drove it, what the War Cabinet minutes show about the internal debate, why the standard account that most people carry is incomplete in ways that matter, and what the Soviet Union's entry into the Pacific War has to do with a decision that history has almost entirely credited to 2 American bombs. We're going to talk about the Yasukuni Shrine, which stands in central Tokyo today, which enshrines 14 men convicted as class war criminals alongside 2.5 million ordinary soldiers, and which receives annual visits from Japanese prime ministers who defend those visits as private acts of memorial. We are going to talk about what that means and what it says, and why the countries whose people were killed by the orders of the men enshrined there have never found Japan's explanation adequate. And then, after all of that, we are going to try to understand something genuinely difficult, not to excuse, not to resolve the history into something more comfortable than it is, but to actually understand how the same culture produced both things. How the country that ran human experimentation programs became the country that the world most associates with courtesy and craft and the particular beauty of a life conducted with care. How the transformation happened, what it cost, what it left out, and what it means that a culture can be genuinely admirable on its surface and genuinely unresolved underneath it simultaneously for 80 years in full view of the world. That is what this video is. It is not an attack on Japan. It is not a celebration of Japan. It is an attempt to look at Japan whole, both sides of the gap, the full width of the silence, and to take seriously the question of what it means that the gap exists and why it has lasted as long as it has. There is one more thing you need to know before we begin. The politeness, the specific, structural, extraordinary courtesy that characterizes modern Japanese social life, is not ancient. Not in the form it takes today. The version of Japan that the world knows and admires was built deliberately after 1945 from specific materials, in response to a catastrophe so total that the rebuilding required not just the reconstruction of a physical country, but the reconstruction of a self that the world could look at without seeing what had been there before. The politeness is post-war, and understanding what it was built on top of, what it was constructed to sit over, to cover not dishonestly, but in the way that a culture covers its deepest wounds, with beauty, with discipline, with the extraordinary human capacity to make something of genuine value from the need to not look directly at something unbearable. That is the key to understanding everything else. We begin in 1853. A July morning, a bay outside a city then called Edo. 4 black ships appearing on the horizon, and a country that had been closed to the world for 250 years, realizing for the first time what the world had become while it was not looking. Everything flows from that morning. Let's go. There is a version of Japan that the world has agreed to love. You have seen it. Maybe you have been there. The train that arrives, not just on time, but to the second. And when it is delayed by 4 minutes, the conductor steps out onto the platform and bows in apology to the waiting passengers. The convenience store where every item is wrapped with a precision that suggests someone spent a great deal of time thinking about the dignity of the object inside. The ryokan, the traditional inn, where the host kneels on the floor to greet you, and the towels are folded into shapes that have no practical function except to tell you that someone cared enough to do it. Japan has produced one of the most recognizable aesthetic identities in human history. The minimalism, the devotion to craft, the way a bowl of ramen in the right place in Kyoto can feel like an argument about the nature of beauty. There are whole industries in the West built on trying to understand and import fragments of what Japan does. The concept of wabi-sabi, the imperfect and the transient. The idea of ikigai, your reason for getting up in the morning. The practice of kintsugi, repairing broken ceramics with gold so that the fracture becomes part of the object's history rather than its shame. And the people. Visitors to Japan almost universally report the same thing. The kindness, the patience, the way strangers will walk you to your destination rather than point in its direction. The way shop owners bow as you leave, even after you have already passed through the door, even when you can no longer see them. This is real. It is not a performance for tourists. It is not a surface applied for export. The Japanese people, in their day-to-day interactions, do operate according to a code of social conduct that is genuinely different in its texture and consistency from most of the world. Anyone who has spent significant time in Japan will tell you that the experience recalibrates your sense of what is possible in public life. This is one Japan. Now, the Yasukuni Shrine sits in central Tokyo, a short walk from the Imperial Palace. It was founded in 1869 to honor the souls of those who died in service of the Japanese emperor. Today, it enshrines the spirits of approximately 5 million people. Among them are 14 men classified by the post-war Tokyo Tribunal as class, or war criminals, the category reserved for those who committed crimes against peace, meaning the people who planned and initiated the war itself. One of them is Hideki Tojo, Prime Minister of Japan during the war, the man who authorized the attack on Pearl Harbor, the man who oversaw the system of forced labor that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians across Asia, executed in 1948. enshrined at Yasukuni in 1978. Senior Japanese politicians visit the shrine. Prime ministers have visited. When they do, China and South Korea issue formal protests. The Japanese government responds, not with apology, but with an assertion of the right to honor Japan's war dead. The visits continue. This is also Japan. And the question that this script is going to spend the next hour sitting inside, is not which Japan is the real one. They are both real. The question is how the same national culture produces both of them simultaneously, and how it has managed, for 80 years, to hold the two things in its hands without ever being forced to choose. Most countries that committed atrocities during the 20th century have developed some public reckoning with what they did. The reckoning is often incomplete. It is often strategic, self-serving, timed to political convenience. Germany's reckoning with the Holocaust is the most thorough in history, and it is still contested in corners. The United States has never fully reckoned with the bombing of civilians or the conduct of its Pacific campaign. Britain has never had a real national conversation about what the empire actually did. Every country finds its own way to look slightly to the left of the worst thing it has done. Japan's method is different. Japan did not construct a partial reckoning. Japan constructed an alternative identity, so complete, so genuinely beautiful, so deeply admired by the outside world that the question of reckoning has, for most of the past 80 years, barely needed to arise. When you are the country of the tea ceremony and the bullet train and the Boeing station conductor, the questions that someone might otherwise ask about what happened in Nanjing in 1937 tend not to get asked. Not because they have been suppressed, though some of them have, but because they exist in a different register, a different conversation, one that the aesthetic surface of Japan makes it very easy not to start. That is what we are going to start now. To understand what Japan did, you have to understand what Japan was trying to become. In 1853, a fleet of American warships sailed into Edo Bay, what is now Tokyo Bay, under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry. Perry carried a letter from the President of the United States demanding that Japan open its ports to American trade. Japan had been, for over 2 centuries, a deliberately closed country. The Tokugawa shogunate had sealed Japan from the outside world in 1641, allowing only limited trade through a single Dutch port. It was an intentional policy of isolation. Japan had looked at what European powers were doing to the rest of Asia and had made a decision. Perry's ships, which the Japanese called Kurofune, the black ships, made that decision impossible to sustain. The Americans had steam-powered warships. Japan had wooden sailing vessels. The military imbalance was so severe and so obvious that no serious military resistance was possible. Perry delivered his letter, returned the following year with a larger fleet, and Japan signed the Convention of Kanagawa, opening its ports. This moment broke Japan, not physically, but psychologically. The realization that the outside world had developed technologies and military capabilities that made Japanese sovereignty fragile, that the isolation which had felt like strength was in the face of industrial power, a form of vulnerability, sent Japanese society into a convulsion. The Tokugawa shogunate, which had held power for over 2 centuries, collapsed within 15 years of Perry's arrival. What replaced it was the Meiji Restoration. The Meiji period, beginning in 1868, is one of the most remarkable state-directed transformations in modern history. Japan looked at the Western powers that had humiliated it and decided to become them as fast as possible, more completely than anyone thought possible. Japanese officials were sent to Europe and America to study their legal systems, their educational systems, their military structures, their industrial methods. What they brought back was transplanted into Japanese society with extraordinary speed and discipline. Within 40 years of the Meiji Restoration, Japan had industrialized, built a modern military, and defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. The first time in the modern era that an Asian nation had defeated a European power in open conflict. The lesson Japan took from this was the lesson that the Western powers had been teaching the world for 3 centuries. Strength is empire. Security comes from territory. The way to ensure that no fleet of black ships could ever again arrive at your shores and dictate terms was to build your own fleet, your own empire, your own sphere of domination. This is not a rationalization. It is a description of the logic that drove Japanese expansion, a logic that was at that time considered not just acceptable, but admirable by the Western powers who employed the same logic in Africa, in South Asia, in the Americas, in the Pacific. Japan was not inventing colonialism. Japan was learning it from the countries that had made it the organizing principle of the modern world. What Japan added was a specific ideological framework, the concept of Pan-Asianism, the idea that Japan was not merely conquering, but liberating, freeing Asia from Western colonial domination and bringing it under the benevolent leadership of its most advanced civilization. Japan was not an invader. Japan was a liberator. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, as it came to be called, was the ideological container for an empire that would, at its peak, encompass Korea, Manchuria, large parts of China, Southeast Asia, the Philippines, and much of the Pacific. The ideology was believed by some of those who deployed it and used cynically by others, as all imperial ideologies are. What it created, in combination with the specific structure of Japanese military culture, was a system that was capable of extraordinary violence and incapable of acknowledging that violence as such. The Japanese military in the 1930s operated under a code that elevated obedience and sacrifice to an almost metaphysical status. The emperor was not a political leader. The emperor was divine. To serve the emperor was not a duty but a spiritual practice. To die for the emperor was not a sacrifice but a consummation. The soldier who surrendered was not a pragmatist. He was a disgrace. Surrender was a form of death, worse than death, because it was a death that preceded dying. This created a military culture in which the conventional constraints on violence, the ones that come from imagining yourself in the position of the enemy, or from the belief that one day you will have to answer for what you have done, were systematically removed. Prisoners were not people who had chosen life over honor, as a Western military framework might understand them. They were people who had proven themselves incapable of the most basic form of self-respect. And people who could not respect themselves could not reasonably expect to be respected by their captors. This is the logic that produced Nanjing. It did not come from nowhere. It was built methodically over decades inside a specific military and political culture that had been deliberately constructed. And it is that deliberateness that makes what came next so difficult to look at and so important not to look away from. In December 1937, the Japanese Imperial Army captured Nanjing, the capital of the Republic of China. What followed is known as the Nanjing Massacre, or the Rape of Nanjing. It lasted approximately 6 weeks. The historical consensus, established through decades of research and cross-referenced across Chinese records, Japanese diaries, Western eyewitness testimony, photographic evidence, and post-war tribunal documentation, is that Japanese troops killed somewhere between 100 zero-zand and 300 zero civilians and prisoners of war in that period. The range reflects genuine methodological disagreement among historians about how to count, not disagreement about whether it happened. It happened. Before we go further, it is worth being precise about what happened, because the word massacre can flatten things into a number in a way that makes it possible to absorb and move past without really understanding. The Japanese forces did not kill 100,000 to 300,000 people in combat. The war fighting was largely over by the time the army entered Nanjing. What occurred in those 6 weeks was the deliberate killing of people who were not fighting, prisoners of war, civilians, men, women, children, the elderly. Some were executed in mass killings on the banks of the Yangtze River. Some were buried alive. Some were used for bayonet practice. Some were burned. The sexual violence was systematic and staggering in scale. Tens of thousands of women and girls were raped, many of them killed afterward. There were Western nationals in Nanjing at the time. A group of them, American, German, and other European residents, established what they called the Nanjing Safety Zone, a protected area they hoped the Japanese military would respect. They kept records. John Rabe, a German businessman and, at that time, a member of the Nazi Party, documented what he witnessed in a diary that would later be used as evidence at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. He wrote about what he saw, not as someone inclined to exaggeration. He wrote as someone who was genuinely struggling to process what human beings were doing to other human beings in front of him. Minnie Vautrin was an American missionary educator who ran Jinling College, which became a refuge for approximately 10,000 women and girls during the massacre. She kept a diary. She walked among the Japanese soldiers trying to physically protect the women under her care. She recorded what she witnessed. She returned to the United States in 1940, suffered a mental breakdown from which she never recovered, and died by suicide the following year. These testimonies exist. The photographs exist. Japanese soldiers brought cameras. The post-war testimonies of Japanese veterans who were present exist, including accounts given publicly by men who spent the rest of their lives unable to stop seeing what they had done. The tribunal records exist, and yet, the standard Japanese high school history textbook today devotes, on average, less than a paragraph to the Nanjing massacre. Some approved textbooks use the phrase, the Nanjing incident. Some describe Confucian, in which many civilians died. The Tokyo Metropolitan Board of Education has approved textbooks that describe the events in language calibrated to produce maximum ambiguity with minimum denial, language that acknowledges something happened while making it structurally impossible for a student to understand what. This is not accidental. In 1982, the Japanese government revised its textbook screening process to require that descriptions of Japanese military aggression toward other Asian nations be softened. The word aggression, in reference to the advance into China, was changed in some approved texts to advance. This triggered formal diplomatic protests from China and South Korea. The Japanese government's response was to introduce what it called the Neighboring Countries Clause, requiring that textbook descriptions of historical events take into account the feelings of neighboring nations. In practice, the clause has been applied inconsistently and has not prevented continued dilution of the historical record. There is a museum in Nanjing, the Memorial Hall of the Victims in Nanjing Massacre by Japanese invaders, that contains the remains of some of those killed, recovered from mass graves. It receives millions of visitors a year, mostly Chinese. Japanese tourists visit in smaller numbers. Some of the Japanese visitors leave messages in the guestbooks, messages of grief, of apology, written in Japanese, placed alongside the testimonies and the bones. Those individual Japanese are not the problem. The problem is not that no Japanese person has ever confronted what happened in Nanjing. The problem is that confronting it is, in Japan, a private and courageous act rather than a national one. The Japanese person who stands in that museum and feels grief is doing something their own government and their own educational system have made harder, not easier. They arrived at that grief despite the structure of Japanese public life, not because of it. That distinction matters enormously, and it becomes even more important when you understand that Nanjing, in the catalogue of what Japan did, is not the most extreme example. It is the most documented. It is the most visible. It is the one that has generated the most diplomatic conflict. The most extreme example involves a compound in Manchuria, a series of prisoners who were referred to in Japanese military documents, not as people, but as logs, and a set of scientific results that the United States government decided in 1945 were worth more than any prosecution could be. Approximately 100 kilometers south of the city of Harbin, in the Manchurian region of northeastern China, there was a complex of buildings spread across 6 square kilometers. It was established in 1936 by the Imperial Japanese Army. Its official name was the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. Its real function was the development of biological and chemical weapons tested on living human beings. It was called Unit 731. The commander was Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii. Ishii was not a rogue officer operating outside the knowledge of the Japanese High Command. He was a decorated military doctor, a graduate of Kyoto Imperial University, a man who had spent time in Europe studying Western approaches to military medicine and returned with a specific vision that biological weapons were the future of warfare and that the only way to develop them effectively was to test them on human subjects under controlled conditions. The program he built at Unit 731 was, in its clinical structure, a masterpiece of bureaucratic organization applied to something that exists outside the boundaries of what human beings are supposed to do to each other. The prisoners, Chinese, Korean, Mongolian, Soviet, some American and Allied POWs, were referred to by the researchers as Maruta. The word means logs. It was a functional description. The prisoners were raw material for experiments. They were not patients. They were not enemies. They were not even, within the operational language of the facility, people. They were logs. The experiments conducted at Unit 731 included the deliberate infection of subjects with plague, cholera, typhoid, anthrax, and other pathogens in order to study disease progression and develop biological weapons, delivery systems. Vivisection. Surgery performed on conscious, living subjects without anesthetic in order to study organ function in real time, with anesthetic excluded, not for shortage, but because the researchers believed that anesthetic would alter the physiological data. Frostbite experiments in which subjects' limbs were frozen and then subjected to various rewarming techniques to study tissue damage. Pressure experiments in which subjects were placed in pressure chambers and the pressure altered to study the effects on the human body at various extremes. Weapon testing in which subjects were tied to stakes in open fields and exposed to biological weapon delivery systems to test the effective radius of infection. There were also experiments in which subjects were surgically altered, organs removed, limbs amputated and reattached to different positions to study wound management under field conditions. Approximately 3,000 people were killed in Unit 731's experiments. Some accounts place the number higher. The range reflects incomplete records rather than scholarly disagreement about the nature of the program. The facility operated for 9 years. In August 1945, as Soviet forces advanced into Manchuria, Ishii ordered the facility destroyed. The prisoners who remained alive were killed. The buildings were demolished. The researchers returned to Japan. Ishii told them to take the data and take their silence in that order. And here is where the story becomes something more than a story about Japan. The United States military arrived in Japan in 1945 to conduct the occupation and oversee the war crimes tribunals. American intelligence officers became aware of Unit 731 and of the data it had generated. The data: years of research on biological weapons, disease transmission, and human physiological response, was considered by American military and scientific authorities to be of significant strategic value, particularly in the context of the emerging Cold War and the United States' own biological weapons program. A decision was made. Shiro Ishii and the senior researchers of Unit 731 would not be prosecuted in exchange for the data, all of it, the results of 9 years of experiments conducted on thousands of living human beings. They would receive immunity from prosecution. The agreement was concealed from the other Allied powers. It was concealed from the Soviet Union, which had captured some Unit 731 personnel and tried and convicted them in 1949 in the Khabarovsk war crimes trials. Trials that the Western press largely dismissed as communist propaganda, in part because the United States had reason to prefer that they not be taken seriously. Ishii died in 1959 of throat cancer, having never been charged with any crime. Several of his senior colleagues went on to prominent careers in Japanese medicine, academia, and public health. The Japanese medical establishment, which absorbed their research and in some cases their persons, did not, as an institution, acknowledge what that research had cost. The data from Unit 731 was classified by the United States government. It remained classified for decades. Historians working in the 1980s and 1990s, using Freedom of Information requests and parallel research in Japanese archives, began to reconstruct what had happened and what the deal had looked like. The reconstruction is not complete. There are documents that remain classified. There are files that were destroyed. There are people who took what they knew and ensured it would not outlive them. What the reconstruction shows clearly enough is this: the most systematic program of human experimentation in the history of modern warfare was ended not by justice, but by a transaction. The people who ran it walked away. The country that granted them immunity did so because the alternative, a prosecution that would have forced a public accounting of what biological weapons research actually requires, was considered less useful than the science. And the science, such as it was, the science extracted from human beings who had been described as logs, was filed, classified, and absorbed into the research programs of the country that had just finished fighting a war against everything Unit 731 represented. This is not ancient history. It is recent enough that some of the people involved were alive when you were born. By the summer of 1945, Japan was losing the war in a way that had become structurally irreversible. The Pacific Island campaigns had been catastrophic. Island by island, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. The Japanese military had fought with a ferocity that extracted enormous costs from American forces and had, in the end, changed nothing about the trajectory of the war. The Japanese Navy, which had been among the most powerful in the world in 1941, had been effectively destroyed. American submarines were cutting off supply lines to the Japanese home islands. American bombing raids were systematically destroying Japanese cities. Conventional bombing raids, incendiary raids, raids that killed more people per night than the atomic bombs would later kill in a single moment. The March 1945 firebombing of Tokyo killed somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 people in a single night and destroyed approximately 16 square miles of the city. It is less remembered than Hiroshima because it does not fit as cleanly into the narrative of technological rupture. But in terms of immediate death toll, it was comparable. Japan's civilian population was being rationed to starvation levels. Military planners were training civilians, women, children, the elderly, to resist an Allied land invasion using bamboo spears. The word used for this preparation was gyokusai, a beautiful death, a shattering of the jewel. The idea that the Japanese people as a whole would be destroyed before they would submit. Inside Japan's war cabinet, the debate about what to do was producing something close to paralysis. There were factions who understood, rationally, that the war was over, that continuing to fight would result in national annihilation with no strategic benefit. And there were factions who believed that national annihilation was preferable to the dishonor of surrender, and who controlled enough of the military apparatus to make surrender politically impossible without something that could be described as an external compulsion. The conventional historical narrative says that the atomic bombs provided that external compulsion. Hiroshima on August the 6th, Nagasaki on August 9th, Japan's surrender on August the 15th. The chronology is correct. The causation is more complicated. The internal records of Japan's Supreme War Council, the six-man body that made the final decision, show that Hiroshima, devastating as it was, did not immediately shift the internal calculus. The militarist faction within the council continued to argue for continuation. The debate after Hiroshima looks remarkably similar to the debate before it. People who wanted to fight to the end, and people who wanted to find a way to end that could be framed as something other than defeat. What broke the deadlock was not the second bomb. On August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. The Soviet advance was rapid and overwhelming. Within days, the Kwantung Army, which Japan had considered its most capable force and which had been held in reserve against precisely this eventuality, was collapsing. The significance of this is difficult to overstate in the context of the internal Japanese debate. Japan had been hoping in its more rational moments to use the Soviet Union as an intermediary, to negotiate some form of conditional surrender through Moscow that would preserve the emperor, preserve the military's role in Japanese society, and avoid the total submission of an unconditional surrender to the Western allies. That hope was not fantasy. It was actual policy, being actively pursued through diplomatic channels in Moscow, even as the bombs fell. The Soviet invasion ended that option completely. The one possible off-ramp had closed, and simultaneously it introduced a new and different threat, the possibility of Soviet occupation of the Japanese home islands, which the Japanese leadership, who were broadly aware of what Soviet occupation had meant for German territory, considered categorically worse than American occupation. The combination of the bombs and the Soviet invasion created together a situation in which the faction arguing for continuation could no longer credibly argue that continuation led anywhere other than either annihilation at American hands or occupation at Soviet hands. The emperor himself intervened, an act that was, within the Japanese constitutional and cultural framework, extraordinary, and expressed his wish that the war end. Japan surrendered. The narrative of the bombs as the single cause of the surrender has been most aggressively maintained by the United States because it is the narrative that most clearly justifies the decision to use them. It is also the narrative that Japan itself, for different reasons, has found useful. It positions Japan as victim of an unprecedented technological horror, a framing that coexists with and partially displaces the alternative framing of Japan as perpetrator of unprecedented atrocities. Both things happened. Japan was victim of the bombs. Japan was perpetrator of the massacres. The framing as victim is not false. It is a selection. And it is a selection that has served for 80 years a specific purpose. It gives Japan a wound it can show the world, a wound that is real, documented, photographed, memorialized, and, critically, unambiguous. No one disputes what happened at Hiroshima. The mushroom cloud is in every history book. The shadows burned into the steps of Sumitomo Bank, where a person sat and was vaporized and left only the outline of their presence. Those shadows are still there. Japan has a memorial. Japan has a story about what was done to it. And in the space that story occupies in the global consciousness, there is less room for the stories about what Japan did to others. Not no room, but less. Her name was Xia Shuqin. She was 8 years old when the Japanese army entered Nanjing in December 1937. She was the third of 7 children. Her family lived in the city. When the soldiers came to her neighborhood, her parents were killed. Her 2 oldest sisters were taken. Of the 7 children, 2 survived, Xia Shuqin and a younger sister, who survived by hiding under the bodies of the people who had been killed around her and remaining still for long enough that the soldiers left. Xia Shuqin was interviewed multiple times in the decades following the massacre. By the 1990s, she was elderly, and the interviews were sometimes conducted at the Nanjing Memorial, in the building that had been constructed to hold the evidence of what happened and to ensure that those who had been killed would not be forgotten without being named. She spoke clearly. She spoke without the quality of performance that sometimes enters testimony that has been given many times. She spoke as someone who had spent 60 years in the company of what she had seen and had reached a point where it simply was what it was, where the distance between the memory and the present moment had collapsed to nothing because it had never really existed. She said that for years she could not look at Japanese people. She said that she had eventually come to understand that the people who had come to Nanjing were not the same as the Japanese people she might encounter on the street. Though she was careful about how she framed that distinction, because she was also honest about the fact that the distinction was sometimes hard to hold. She was asked once whether she wanted an apology. She said she wanted an acknowledgement. She said that an apology without acknowledgement was a performance, and that she had seen enough performances. She died in 2015. She was 85 years old. At the same time, and in the same city, a young Japanese soldier named Azuma Shiro kept a diary. Azuma had been conscripted. He was 22 years old. He had grown up in rural Japan, had worked on his family's farm, had not chosen the army. The diary he kept during the Nanjing campaign is one of the most disturbing documents to emerge from that period. Not because it describes atrocities in the manner of a war criminal, but because it describes them in the manner of a person who knows what he is seeing and is in real time working to find a frame for it that allows him to keep functioning. The early entries are conventional. A young man describing the physical hardship of the campaign, the cold, the exhaustion, the particular quality of light over the Chinese countryside. There is homesickness. There are descriptions of food. There is the ordinary texture of a person's inner life. And then Nanjing. The entries do not become the entries of a monster. That is what makes them almost unbearable to read. They become the entries of a person who is witnessing and in some cases participating in things that his frame of reference cannot accommodate, and who is, in real time, developing a new frame. You can see it happening. You can watch, entry by entry, the process by which a human being absorbs the evidence of his own actions by reclassifying the people around whom those actions take place. The prisoners are not people in the way that the people at home are people. The prisoners have demonstrated through their surrender that they are not fully realized in the way that a soldier who fights to the death is fully realized. The reclassification is not sudden. It is incremental. It arrives in language first. The language shifts before the actions do, and by the time the language has completed its work, the actions that would have been unthinkable at the beginning of the diary are simply what is done. Azuma survived the war. He returned to Japan. He lived for decades with what he had done and what he had seen. And in the 1980s, when Japanese historians and journalists began the process of trying to document what had actually happened in Nanjing from the Japanese side. He spoke. He did not minimize. He did not hide inside the language of orders and obedience. He said what he had done. He said what he had seen others do. He said that he had been in Nanjing, a person he did not recognize, and that the person he did not recognize had done things that he could not undo, and that he had spent the rest of his life in the company of that person. He was sued by a Japanese nationalist group for defaming the honor of the Japanese military. He won, eventually. The process took years. The two of them, Sha Shuqing and Azuma Shiro, were inside the same event. Neither of them is simple. Both of them knew something that their respective national cultures have found it consistently difficult to accommodate. That what happened in Nanjing was done by people to people, that the people who did it were made, not born, and that the people to whom it was done lived with it in their bodies for the rest of their lives. The distance between Tokyo and Nanjing is about 1,700 kilometers. The distance between the Japan that Azuma came home to and the acknowledgement that Xia Shuqin asked for has, in 80 years, not meaningfully closed. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, formerly the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, convened in May 1946 and concluded in November 1948. 28 Japanese military and government leaders were indicted. 7 were sentenced to death and executed, including Hideki Tojo. The others received prison sentences, life sentences in several cases. The tribunal was modeled on the Nuremberg trials, with significant differences in both process and outcome. The most significant difference was not procedural. It was the decision made by General Douglas MacArthur and ultimately sanctioned by the American government about who would and would not be prosecuted. Emperor Hirohito was not indicted. The decision was political. MacArthur believed, and the evidence supports the belief, that prosecuting the emperor would destabilize the occupation and potentially trigger a resistance movement that would make Japan ungovernable. The emperor's divine status within Japanese culture was such that a trial would be understood not as justice, but as an assault on the spiritual foundation of Japanese society. The occupation required Japanese cooperation. Japanese cooperation required, in MacArthur's assessment, the preservation of the emperor. So, the emperor was preserved. His role in the decisions of the war, which was real, though historians debate its precise extent, was not examined by the tribunal. A narrative was constructed in which the emperor had been a figurehead, manipulated by militarists who acted in his name, but not on his instruction. The narrative served the occupation's purposes. It also served the post-war Japanese government's purposes, and it shaped the way Japan was able to understand the war as something done by extremists, a deviation from the true Japanese character, rather than as the product of a system in which the emperor and the culture and the military and the state had been thoroughly integrated. The Unit 731 deal was a separate transaction, conducted earlier and more quietly, but its logic was identical. The pursuit of American strategic interests took precedence over the pursuit of justice, and the victims of Unit 731, Chinese Korean, Mongolian, Soviet, were not at the table when that decision was made. The occupation ended formally in 1952. Japan regained its sovereignty. Many of those who had been convicted at the Tokyo Tribunal were released early under a 1958 amnesty. The men who had been sentenced to life terms were paroled. The 7 who had been executed were, posthumously, the ones who could not benefit from the changing political climate. And then, in 1978, the 14 class. War criminals were enshrined at Yasukuni. The decision was made by the shrine's priests without public announcement. It was revealed the following year. The emperor, who had visited Yasukuni regularly since the war, stopped visiting after the enshrinement. He never visited again, and neither has the current emperor. But senior politicians have visited, are visiting, and have defended their visits as an expression of respect for Japan's war dead. The enshrinement is the clearest symbol of what did not happen in Japan after the war. In Germany, it is illegal to display Nazi symbols in public. There is no shrine in Berlin where convicted Nazi war criminals are honored as spiritual entities. The legal and cultural framework of post-war Germany was built at considerable national effort to prevent the rehabilitation of the ideology that had produced the crimes. In Japan, the men who planned the war that produced the massacres are enshrined in a shrine that sits in the national capital, that receives public funding, and that sends out an annual ceremony attended by members of the government. This is not hidden. It is public. It generates protests from China and South Korea every year, and every year the Japanese government manages those protests, and every year the shrine remains. The deal, whether you mean the deal over the emperor, the deal over Unit 731, or the implicit deal of the entire occupation, was this: Japan would be remade, would be democratized, would be integrated into the American-led post-war order, would become an economic miracle, would become the Japan of the bullet trains and the convenience stores and the bowing station conductor. And in exchange, certain things would not be fully examined. The examination that happened would be sufficient to satisfy the demands of a victor's justice, but it would not go further. It would not reach into the structure of Japanese society and ask the questions that Germany was, over decades, asked. The result is a country that is, by almost any external measure, a remarkable success story, and a country that has, by any honest internal measure, an unfinished conversation at its center. There is a Japanese concept, not a word that translates neatly, for the difference between what one shows and what one holds, tatame and hone. Tatame is the public face, the social presentation, the version of yourself that functions in the shared space. Hone is the inner truth, the feeling behind the function. The distinction is not hypocrisy. In the Japanese framework, it is social architecture. The maintenance of tatame is a form of respect for the people around you, a willingness to manage your inner life privately so that the shared space remains navigable for everyone. The concept is often explained to foreigners as a way of understanding why Japanese people are sometimes described as difficult to read. Why yes can mean no. Why the absence of disagreement is not agreement. Why the maintenance of surface harmony can coexist with quite profound dissatisfaction. These are real observations. And the tatame-hone distinction is a real part of Japanese social life. But it is worth sitting with what this concept has meant at the national level in the context of the post-war history. What Japan has maintained nationally is a form of tatame, the public face of Japan. The bullet trains, the tea ceremony, the Nobel Prizes in chemistry and physics and literature, the anime, the cuisine, the precision, the courtesy, is not false. These things are genuinely what they appear to be. The kindness of Japanese people in daily life is real. The aesthetic intelligence of Japanese culture is real. The tatame is not a lie. What is held in the home, the inner truth that is maintained privately, managed carefully, not brought into the shared space, includes Nanjing, includes Unit 731, includes the comfort women, the women from Korea, China, the Philippines, and elsewhere who were conscripted or coerced into sexual slavery for the Japanese military during the war, and whose story has been the subject of sustained diplomatic conflict between Japan and South Korea for decades, centered partly on the continued existence of a statue in Seoul and Japan's persistent pressure to have it removed. The management of these things at the national level mirrors, in structure the management of difficulty at the individual level. You do not bring the difficult thing into the shared space. You manage it. You allow the shared space to remain navigable. You maintain the surface. The problem that Xia Shuqin was naming when she said she wanted acknowledgement rather than apology, is that this works only when both parties agree to the arrangement. The people inside Japan can, if they choose, participate in the national tatame. They can teach their children the softened textbook version. They can visit the Yasukuni shrine. They can sustain a relationship to the past that is managed, contained, and not permitted to disturb the surface of the present. The people outside Japan, the survivors of Nanjing, the families of those killed in Unit 731, the former comfort women and their descendants, the Koreans whose grandparents were worked as forced labor in Japanese mines and factories, did not choose to participate in the arrangement. The tatame was not offered to them. The maintenance of the shared surface was not a comfort available to people who lived inside the wound. There have been apologies, several of them, from several Japanese prime ministers. The Murayama Statement of 1995, issued on the 50th anniversary of the end of the war, is the most comprehensive, expressing feelings of deep remorse and heartfelt apology for the suffering caused by Japan's colonial rule and aggression. It has been reaffirmed by subsequent governments. The apologies are real statements. They have also been repeatedly undermined, sometimes within days of being issued, by statements from other Japanese politicians contesting the characterization of Japan's wartime conduct, visiting the Yasukuni shrine, or asserting that comfort women were not coerced. The pattern is consistent enough to have a name: apology diplomacy. The apology manages the international relationship. The domestic politics proceed independently. The silence that surrounds these events inside Japan is not complete. There are Japanese historians, journalists, educators, and ordinary citizens who have spent careers confronting this history and trying to bring it into the shared space. They have faced resistance. They have faced legal action. They have faced a form of social exclusion that has its own particular quality in a society where the maintenance of surface harmony is a structural value. The silence is not enforced by law. Japan is a democracy with a free press. The silence is maintained, as the most durable silences are, by the social cost of breaking it, by the sense, which is not imaginary, that to bring the difficult thing into the shared space is to do damage to something real and valued. The bullet train is real. The courtesy is real. The aesthetic culture is real. The Japan that the world loves is real. To stand inside that Japan and insist on talking about Nanjing feels, to many Japanese people, like an act of aggression against the very things that make Japan worth defending. That is the genius of it, if you can call it genius. The beauty is not a distraction from the silence. The beauty is the architecture of the silence. So where did it come from? Not the culture itself. Japanese culture has a history of extraordinary depth and complexity that long predates the war and long predates the specific version of Japan that the world now loves. But the particular expression of it, the intensity of the social courtesy, the precision of the service culture, the systematic, almost architectural quality of the consideration that Japanese society extends to strangers, the Japan that the world experiences today, the Japan of the Konbini and the Omotenashi and the Shinkansen, crystallized in a specific historical moment. That moment was 1945. The Japan that came out of the Second World War was a country that had been comprehensively defeated, comprehensively occupied, and comprehensively required to rebuild itself under the supervision of a foreign power. The physical destruction was extraordinary. The psychological destruction, the collapse of the ideology that had sustained the entire social order, the revelation that the emperor was not divine, the absorption of a national narrative that had been built around invincibility was of a different order entirely. A society in that condition has certain options available to it. It can resist the occupation. Japan, exhausted and pragmatic, did not. It can collapse into anomie, into the nihilism that follows the destruction of a meaning structure. Japan, characteristically, did not. It can rebuild, adopt, adapt, and direct the same ferocious collective energy that it had directed toward empire, towards something else entirely. Japan chose reconstruction, and the reconstruction that Japan undertook was not simply economic, it was social. It was a deliberate, systematic, and extraordinarily successful project of national rebranding, though that word is too shallow for what actually occurred. The American occupation shaped what Japan became in ways that are easy to underestimate. The American administrators, MacArthur and the people around him, had genuine ideals about what Japanese democracy could look like. They wrote a constitution for Japan. Article 9 of that constitution renounces war as a sovereign right and prohibits the maintenance of a war-making capability. The pacifism encoded in Article 9 is not simply an American imposition. It became, over decades, genuinely internalized by significant portions of Japanese society. The defeat created a pacifist culture among a people who had, 15 years earlier, been prepared to fight to national extinction. But the social courtesy, the omotenashi, the precision of the service, the bow, is not in the Constitution. It emerged from something else, from the specific experience of a people who had been told, in the most absolute terms available to history, that the way they had been living and the values they had organized themselves around were unacceptable to the world, that the pride they had taken in their national project was not pride that the rest of the world was going to recognize. The response to that, not a conscious, articulated response, but a cultural response, the kind that happens across millions of people over decades, was to find the forms of national pride that the world could not object to. And Japan found them in the things it had always done well: craft, precision, attention, service, the transformation of everyday functions into something close to art. The konbini, the convenience store that is more carefully designed and more meticulously maintained than almost any equivalent in the world, is not just a business strategy, it is a statement. It says, look at what we make. Look at how we do things. Look at the care we bring to the ordinary. This is what we are. And the world did look, and the world did love it. And the looking and the loving and the cultural admiration created a space, a comfortable, warm, well-lit space, in which certain conversations remained unnecessary. The hon, again. The tatame, again. But now, at civilizational scale, there is a concept in Japanese aesthetics, ma, which refers to negative space, to the pause, to the interval between things. Ma is not absence, it is presence of a particular kind. The silence between the notes is part of the music. The silence around what Japan did is, in this sense, ma. It is not the absence of acknowledgement, it is the presence of something else, precisely maintained, that fills the space where acknowledgement would otherwise have to go. This is not unique to Japan. Every culture manages its silences, but Japan's silences are managed with the same extraordinary intentionality that Japan brings to everything else. The bullet train is on time, the towel is folded, the bow is precise, and the thing that is not said with the same disciplined, refined, practiced care that Japan brings to everything it does. That is the thing you have to sit with. The culture is not separate from the silence. The culture is what the silence is made of. Japan is not the only country that has refused to fully reckon with what it did. The United States carpet-bombed civilians in North Korea until there was, by American military assessment, nothing left to bomb. It conducted a war in Vietnam that killed between 1.5 and 3.5 million Vietnamese people, the majority of them civilians, and has constructed a national memory of that war almost entirely from the perspective of American suffering. It dropped incendiary bombs on Japanese cities and decided, through a process that has never been fully publicly examined, that the technology it then used to end that war was a triumph rather than a catastrophe. The reckoning with these things exists in fragments, in literature, in some academic history, in particular, corners of American public life. But it has never become a national conversation of the kind that would change what the United States teaches its children about itself. France has not reckoned with Algeria. Britain has not reckoned with the Bengal famine, or with the concentration camps of the Boer War, or with the systematic extraction of wealth from the Indian subcontinent across 2 centuries. Belgium has not reckoned with the Congo. Turkey has not reckoned with the Armenians. The incomplete reckoning is not a Japanese pathology. It is a human one. But Japan's specific version of it is worth attending to because of how it is achieved. Most countries that have not reckoned with their histories do so through some combination of ignorance and forgetting. The events are not taught. The events are not remembered. The events recede into the past and become, with time, sufficiently distant that the not reckoning can be mistaken for simply having moved on. Japan has not forgotten. Japan has not moved on in that sense. The Yasukuni Shrine is not an oversight. The textbook language is not accident. The pattern of apologies followed by political statements that undercut them is not confusion. These are the products of an active, ongoing, and by any honest assessment, remarkably successful management of a historical problem. And the tool that makes the management possible is the culture itself. The thing that the world loves, the thing that is real and genuinely lovable. The bullet train arrives on time, and the station master bows, and a tourist takes a photograph, and the photograph goes somewhere where someone sees it. And the image of Japan that it creates is the image of a country that has mastered something the rest of the world has not mastered. And in that image, there is no room for Nanjing. Not because Nanjing has been deleted, but because Nanjing requires a different kind of attention than the attention that the image solicits. The image asks you to admire. Nanjing asks you to sit with something that does not resolve. These are not compatible states. That incompatibility is the thing worth ending on. The world has developed a considerable appetite for Japan, for its food, its design, its storytelling, its aesthetics, its way of being in the world. That appetite is not a manipulation. Japan has genuinely produced things that are worth the world's admiration. The tragedy, if it is a tragedy, and it is something, is that the admiration has functioned as a kind of resolution, as if the beauty of what Japan makes in the present is a sufficient answer to what Japan did in the past. It is not a sufficient answer. It is not an answer at all. It is a different question, presented so well that it can be mistaken for one. The survivors of Nanjing, most of them now dead, spent their lives asking to be acknowledged. The former comfort women spent their lives asking to be acknowledged. The families of those who died in Unit 731 are asking to be acknowledged. The acknowledgement they are asking for is not complicated. It is the simplest thing one human being can offer another. I see what happened. I see what was done. I see you. Japan is a country that has made seeing into an art form. The attention it brings to the visual world. The way it frames a bowl, a garden, a folded towel. The light in a particular room is a form of seeing that the rest of the world has recognized as genuinely extraordinary. It is worth asking what it means that the same culture that sees so precisely has spent 80 years not seeing this. It is worth asking. It does not have an easy answer, and the absence of an easy answer is not a reason to stop asking. That is where we will leave it.